We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Matthew Grimes. He's the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Cleveland Guardians. Matthew, it's so good to see you. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for folks who are listening, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah, Christina, thanks for having me. Really excited. Again, Matt Grimes, I use he, him pronouns, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of serving as the inaugural head of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the Cleveland Guardians baseball organization under the umbrella of Major League Baseball. Your question is really interesting to me because as I think back to what I wanted to be when I grew up, I actually think I wanted to be a bus driver or a taxi driver. I grew up in a pretty low income neighborhood. My family didn't have access to our own personal vehicle growing up. So I use public transportation quite often. And I was always fascinated with the ability of vehicles to transport people around. Fast forward 25 years. Didn't quite land there, but still very much fascinated with travel and the ability to move between places and spaces. So I think that's how I would have answered it back then.
I love that. I think someone else also answered. They were like, I want to be just like my bus driver because
Ah,
they saw them every day, and it's that model behavior. And who do you look up to as well? And that accessibility of transportation, I definitely agree with you, is so interesting as well. I also wanted to ask, you fast forward, you are at Cleveland Guardians. How has your personal journey really led you here and to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
yeah, I always say that it's education that got me into baseball and baseball that got me into education prior to this role with the Cleveland Guardians. I was an educator. I started as a classroom teacher before moving into school systems leadership. But that journey really started early on in my childhood. I grew up in a very diverse community in upstate New York. And it just happened to also be a predominantly Puerto Rican and Dominican community. So a lot of the friends that I had growing up were Spanish speaking and Latin. I identify as biracial. My mom is white, my dad was black. And so already I was a minority amongst a majority within a community of minorities. So it was a very unique position to be in growing up. But as I started to grow up and get a little older, baseball became a pretty critical part of my life. And I started to realize that the friends that I had on the diamond were not the same friends that I had in school, even though this was during a time of school zoning. So we all lived within a 1 mile radius of each other. And as I peel back the layers and reflect now as an adult and as a former teacher, I realized that there were a lot of systems and structures that were hindering, in this case, Black and Brown students from being able to achieve things like educational tracking, misidentification of students with special needs. All of those things played into my friends and my peers' inability to really succeed in an education system. And that was really the first glance of what educational inequity could do to people. And really motivated me to want to work on the equity side of things to create access and opportunity. Um, Simultaneously, I also grew up in the late 90s when if you turn the TV on, particularly in the American League of Major League Baseball, at that point, the Cleveland Indians were all the rave. And so I'm a loyal person and said I would be an Indians fan, even though I grew up in New York, and that stuck. So when they had the opportunity to actually start my teaching career, I taught here in Cleveland, in the city of Cleveland, and have since bounced back. And that's sort of been the trajectory. How I got into DEI work explicitly, I always say that I've been doing equity work before equity work became cool or became its own field. A lot of the work that I started doing early on in my education career in the nonprofit space was just making sure that students had opportunities and access, and that inherently is the definition of equity. And as I continued to do that, well, I found a lot of joy inside of the classroom. I was even more fulfilled by looking structurally at some of the policies and programs that were inherently unjust and racist and figuring out how we can dismantle them. And that was sort of my entry point into DEI leadership, and really excited to bring that vast set of experiences into the world of professional sports.
Thank you for sharing your journey to this work. I think a lot of practitioners and folks who are in diversity, equity, inclusion, it is very personal. And I appreciate you sharing that with us here today and with our listeners in terms of creating more equity, creating structural change, and making sure that we're thinking about things from that systemic level. I'm sure there are many, and I have a lot of questions to ask, but I want to start out with a really broad one around what's the next problem or situation you are currently trying to solve, or what's taking up the most brain space right now?
I think collectively, this is not unique to our organization, not unique to professional sports, but it's really understanding how the workplace is shifting, particularly in this post-pandemic world. But how is that shifting to better accommodate the needs of historically excluded individuals in the workplace? In my case, I'm particularly interested in the BIPOC community, but also folks who may be neurodivergent, right, who work and think differently. How can we design the office environment and the workplace of the 21st century in a way that really allows us to be our authentic selves, to foster an environment of psychological safety and flexibility so that all individuals, all of our employees can thrive. So that's certainly taking up a lot of my time, just thinking internally, how do we improve in that space? While still winning baseball games and hopefully winning the World Series.
Yes, a lot to think about, and the question of who's in the room making decisions, who's this system built for, does it need to still be this way as well, is really important to really think about underrepresented and historically marginalized communities as well. And I think to your point too, representation is really important. Who we see as role models, the teams we see in our lives from childhood to adulthood are really important. And you mentioned at the time the Cleveland Indians. I want to kind of talk about at a high level. Of course, can you share a little bit of the behind the scenes process of really changing the name of the team to the Cleveland Guardians?
Yeah, I'll start by saying we often talk about our purpose and why we exist here in Cleveland. And our purpose is very simple. The reason we exist as an organization is to unite and inspire our city through the power of team. Unite and inspire our city through the power of team. And so if we peel back the layers historically for over 100 years, we've really struggled in that ability to unite because we had a name that was inherently racist and divisive, right? So fast forward to the summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, the racial awakening that happened in the United States, albeit under the umbrella of a pandemic, we really started to be introspective and reflect on were we living up to those values and to that purpose, that mission of why we exist. And the short answer was no, we weren't, because we heard time and time and again, not only from Native and Indigenous communities, but other civic leaders here in the city of Cleveland and nationally, the impact that our name had. Now, it was never our intent, right, as an organization, to cause harm, but we were, and we did for a very long time. And again, I mentioned the summer of 2020. I think a lot of people, a lot of organizations had a lot of epiphanies during that time. And one of ours was that we are a professional sports team, and we have a responsibility and a huge platform to enact change, social justice. And we weren't really hitting the mark on that. And so we began a very inclusive process of figuring out what would it take to actually change our name and change our brand. And we did that through countless hours of fan surveys and teammate surveys. We surveyed over 40,000 fans and spent countless hours listening and hearing stories about the impact that our name change had on everyone in our community, particularly those who identify as historically excluded or marginalized. And we made the decision that we had to move away from the name Indians. And so that triggered a process of really understanding what was important to our organization, to our community, to our fans in a new name, in a new brand. And we started to uncover a series of different values, things like loyalty, pride, resilience that people really wanted to see in a new name. We also heard time and time and again that it was important that our name reflected our community and our city. It wasn't something that we could have just taken and went to any city and called ourselves the same names. And so we landed on the Guardians for a number of different reasons. There's historical reasons, there's architectural reasons, but as we continue to grow in this new brand, in this new era, we're very cognizant of our history. We're proud of many aspects of our history, but we knew it was the right thing to do if we wanted to be a leader in social justice in sports.
There's a huge opportunity as an employer, as a professional sports team, and with the platform to really make it a difference there as well. And the whole conversation around intent and impact and really thinking critically, asking for feedback is so important as well. And I know you boiled down a couple of the values or the North Stars that came through in that feedback too. And sometimes with diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's so many different avenues you can go depending on where you are as an organization. It can be overwhelming and people try to do a lot, which is really great. What are the 5 key pillars that really guide your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy at Cleveland Guardians?
Yeah, as we continue on our journey and started our journey to becoming more diverse, more equitable, and inclusive, we really started to reframe what DEI can mean in our organization and what it can mean in professional sports. Oftentimes, organizations are fixated on DEI as outcomes, and therefore you see a lot of strategic plans and a lot of action plans that are centered on metrics that increase the number of diversity, that create more equity and more inclusion. And certainly that's what we want to do, but we really see DEI as an accelerant to the change that we want. And when we started to reframe conversations with our employees and with our fans around what does DEI actually mean to our organization, it was less about checking boxes and more about how can diversity, equity, and inclusion help us improve and get better as an organization. And what it boiled down to, again, after many conversations, was that when we are more diverse, when we're more equitable, and we're more inclusive, we're better positioned to do a number of things well. One of those is attract and retain exceptional talent. We know that times are changing. We know that in order to remain competitive, we have to be really intentional about how we are hiring and sourcing racially and in gender and religiously and linguistically and ethically diverse candidates. We believe that we're able to source and attract better when we are more diverse and inclusive. We're also better positioned to bring out the best in everyone. And that's something that we've always valued as an organization. One of our key beliefs is in people. And so when we create environments that are inclusive, that foster a sense of belonging, we know that our employees can thrive. We know that our players can thrive. We know that our fans can thrive. And so that's another aspect of our core strategy and pillars. The other one is we're just better positioned to make better decisions, right? We know all the research shows that when you have more diverse teams, your outcomes are better. You're able to get better perspective, to ask intentionally who's missing from the conversation, to design systems with everyone in mind. And so that's a really important pillar that we're focusing on. And the last two are a little more specific to baseball and to our organization. One of our pillars is to contribute to a thriving city and community. And I mentioned earlier, we know that we have our role as a civic institution is really big, and we have a huge footprint to enact change. And so we want to be really intentional in our community impact strategy to make sure that we're doing things with the community and not just for the community. And then lastly, and this is one of my favorites, one of our pillars is to grow the fan base for new fans and for historically excluded fans. The game of baseball traditionally has been a game for white men and for white male fans. We want to make sure that baseball is accessible to all walks of life and all different types of people. And so we're really focused on what our fan experience looks like and how we can leverage, once again, our new brand as Guardians to ensure that we are growing the game in communities that may not have had access to baseball in the past.
very holistic pillars in terms of the fans, employees, and folks who have been with the brand for a couple of years as well, just following the story of the team as well. We've got the kind of pillars of North Stars and kind of buckets, spheres of influence, if you will. I want to kind of talk about a little bit for examples of how these kind of values and pillars are manifesting across Cleveland Guardians at large. If you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll give some very tangible examples of some of the work we're doing in the community, in our community impact space. We have an incredible community impact team who has worked really intentional over the past few years to ensure that we are creating opportunities for young people in our city to access baseball. We partner very closely with the local school district, local Boys and Girls Club to bring not only baseball, but skill development to communities as well. When we think about growing the fan base, right, we've been doing a lot more around heritage programming and ensuring that we're aligned in celebrating Pride, for example, our Hispanic Heritage Month, 365 days a year, but using those intentional moments in our ballpark to spotlight, uplift, amplify, and educate on the communities that we have here in our wonderful city of Cleveland. So those are just a few examples of how our pillars and plans are manifesting and coming to life. I also think it's worth noting that we don't see them as separate or standalone, and we don't see DEI as a standalone initiative, but rather a core element of how we operate our business and how we operate the game of baseball. And that has also helped bring to life cross-departmental and very diverse initiatives within our entire organization that have allowed a lot of these things to come to life pretty quickly.
I definitely believe that it's everybody's responsibility and kind of role to create a really inclusive environment where people feel like they belong, bring their authentic selves, bring their ex selves to work. From a systemic level, too, there is also unique roles for senior executives, managers, folks who have that decision making power to change policies, initiate new programs as well. How do you kind of design systems to really hold these leaders accountable, especially folks who manage people?
Again, I think it's that shared accountability and distributed leadership.
Yeah.
While I have the honor of upholding the title of head of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, our organization is everyone's responsibility. And that inherently creates accountability amongst peers and amongst our leadership team because we're, in theory, all constantly asking questions and interrogating practices and policies. So that when you design DEI programming and DEI strategies in a way that don't sit in one department or in one silo, it creates a responsibility on everyone in the organization to really drive forth efforts to attaining that ultimate goal of being the most inclusive organization in sports and bringing those five pillars to life.
Absolutely. And the other kind of piece to this as well is nobody is working in silos. This is something that is embedded throughout the organization, throughout decision-making processes as well. How do you really collaborate with other departments and leaders to meet all of these really big shared goals too?
I think that the first entry and vantage point is just by creating awareness and education, right? The field of diversity, equity, and inclusion is still growing, it's still new, and it's ever changing, right? The theoretical frameworks of which DI is built on is constantly evolving and changing. As more organizations get their feet wet in the space of DEI, it leads to just more complexities, and so the need to demystify and really educate on the core tenets and history of DEIB work is critical. And so that's the first piece of just making sure that we're educating folks in the organization in order to get them aligned to what we're doing. On top of the education and training, though, it's making sure that whether you're the finance department or on our baseball side, our hitting department, we're intentionally having these conversations ongoing. And once again, they're embedded in everything that we do. So it's not, okay, this month we're going to talk about DEI. No, DEI is somehow integrated in every department meeting that's happening, every coaching conversation that takes place. And so again, that allows just for a culture of DEI to flourish. I often sort of use the analogy that DEI is this generation's technology. And if we look at technology now, it's everywhere, right? We're using technology, and it's just natural. DEI needs to become that, where it's just built into systems, it's built into infrastructure, it's built into processes, policies, programs, so that again, everyone is able to not only benefit from being more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive, but also everyone's responsible for cultivating that environment.
I love that phrase. I think that is something we should definitely adopt and really think about in terms of a mindset and kind of shift as well. And part of these ongoing conversations, I think someone said it's like a comma or a colon instead of a period at the end of a sentence. You're just continuing and ongoing as well. And some of these conversations are really hard. Sometimes it will be uncomfortable. And you've shared that education, and I agree, is a huge piece, a key to diversity, equity, and inclusion programming internally, and courageous conversations are a part of that. You mentioned this in terms of fans and also knowing that Major League Baseball has seen historically less women and people of color represented. Can you share some of the topics you've had in those conversations within the realm there?
I think the big one and the ongoing conversations, is the role of women in sports and the role of women in baseball. And as we continue to design an organization for the future, we're a lot more intentional about having those conversations and being intentional, um, about how do we make our clubhouse, our spaces, our locker rooms more inclusive. We hope that, someday, in the not so distant future, we will have a female baseball player. We may be years away from that, but we certainly have coaches now, and we have trainers, who are women who are infiltrating a sport that is predominantly male. We have wonderful softball coaches and former players who have the skills and the capabilities and the leadership needed to make a real impact, on the game. And so we have to make sure that we are designing with that future in mind, um, and creating access and opportunities for groups that may not have had, such opportunities in the past.
Yeah, that intentionality is really important, and creating those spaces where people can come in, be the first, and definitely not the last. Something else that you mentioned too, which I think is really interesting, is that folks are really focused on outcomes sometimes when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of times for our webinars and folks to reach out want to know, how do I know if I'm doing a good job, or what do we need to double down on, what do we need to fix? What is your philosophy around measuring the quote unquote impact or ROI of diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, knowing that we are not looking to check a box, but we do want what is working to get invested in?
Yeah, right. So I say that diversity, equity, and inclusion are all outcomes, and they can all be measured. But while they're also measurements, they are a way of being, right? They're a way of operating. They're a core aspect of how organizations should be, and it should be a core fabric of, just how we do business. And so my philosophy is, right, if it's not worth measuring, then you shouldn't do it. But the measurement can't be all, and certainly the quantitative measurement can't be the end goal. This work requires a lot of storytelling, encounter narratives, and qualitative data that can be collected to assess how we're doing, both from a bare bones metrics of, does our workforce reflect the demographics of fans that we serve, but more so to, employee engagement surveys. Uh, do employees feel like they have a sense of belonging? Do our fans and players feel like they belong in our organization? All of that could and should be measured. Um, but it's what you do with that data that matters, right? We can measure it to the end of the day, but if we're not willing and courageous enough to make the changes needed to build a more inclusive system holistically, then the measurement isn't going to take us very far.
Yeah, and that qualitative data isn't always going to be available. People are not going to give you feedback or share their story if they feel like nobody is actively listening as well. And it's a cyclical effect. Matthew, is there anything that I did not ask throughout our conversation that you would like to share or underscoring any kind of key takeaways you hope people bring with them?
No, I just think that as people are listening and watching, really being able to make that connection to how diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to amplify your purpose or your vision as an organization is key and critical. We found a lot of success in being able to disarm conversations. And if there were folks who are resistant, it's a lot easier to help people draw the connection as to why this work matters, certainly from a moral imperative and social justice reasoning, but also from a business case and that ROI. So I would say to anyone that's listening, make sure that you're very clear on your why, and that why should and will look different across organizations, across disciplines. But I think it's really important to not create a diversity strategy, diversity department, a diversity role that is on an island, but rather those conversations, those types of roles, that type of work should be constantly integrated into all that you do.
Absolutely. It should be a foundation, tools that you use every day, both in your personal and professional life, all that we are experiencing here together. Thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I really enjoyed our conversation today, Matt.
Thanks, Christina. It was a pleasure.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.